Welcome to Fuck, Marry, Kill, the podcast where we fuck the unfuckable, marry the unmarryable, and kill the unkillable. Although this episode, we are doing it with things that are fuckable, marryable, and killable, so maybe not the right one to start with that. But welcome to Fuck, Marry, Kill. This is our podcast by Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, and this podcast is all about how everything is reproductive justice. So this week I am talking with Sarah Marshall about how ethical storytelling is a reproductive justice process. Sarah Marshall is the host of my favorite podcast, You're Wrong About, which is a show where they debunk commonly held beliefs about historical moments and individuals and focus on retelling these stories in a way that actually centers the truth, especially about the women in these stories. I'm a huge fan of Sarah. I'm a huge fan of the show, so if you haven't listened to it yet, check it out, and please listen to this episode to hear me fangirl for about an hour or so.
I'm so happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much for being here. So, Sarah, you have played Fuck, Marry, Kill, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I think it's a secretly very revealing game to play with people.
I think so, too. I think it can be a values lesson more than just a time suck, although it does both. Okay, we're going to play Fuck, Marry, Kill, and this is with, for those who have not listened to Sarah's show, this is with 3 of the women who have been scorned in history and who Sarah did a debunking on, and so was able to share more of their full stories and how their stories impact what happened in their lives and how we remember only tiny, tiny pieces of what happened in their lives. So, Sarah, Fuck, Marry, Kill, Courtney Love, Monica Lewinsky, and Tanya Harding.
Okay. I want to marry Monica Lewinsky, which is a response that I'm surprised by. But I feel like she's just like, she's a delicate flower and she needs to be protected from the world. Not that they all don't, but I feel most capable with Monica. And I know that she would decorate our house tastefully with Ethan Allen and put Crabtree and Evelyn stuff in the bathroom because that was the height of luxury in 1998. And I want to fuck Tanya Harding. We would have a great time. It would be cathartic. It would involve, there would be like a pool. There would be a pool table involved because I know she shoots good pool. And I want to kill Courtney Love, but in like a Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty going over the Reichenbach kind of a way, which is the sexiest way to kill someone. And I know that that's, you know, that's what she wants. And we would have a great time doing that as well.
Yeah, if you're going to go out, if you're going to have to kill someone like Courtney Love, you better make it sexy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it would be like, I don't know, just it would be a great album cover, if nothing else.
Yeah, you're going to be on the next cover for sure. I think that's happening for you. So, Sarah, what made you want to start this podcast and what inspired your passion for retelling stories that people often get wrong?
Well, I've always just been irritated by the way people confidently tell clearly incorrect stories. And when I think about it now, that's more my problem than their problem in many senses, because inaccuracy and sort of stories getting smoothed down to something that's easy to pass around is sort of a characteristic of human narrative and storytelling. And also I realize now the stories that we tell in order to keep people in line and in order to tell morality tales about what behavior we consider permissible as a society, including for young women. And so, yeah, my obsession with the story of Tanya Harding and then the story of other kind of women in the 90s, like the ones we just talked about, and also, you know, Anna Nicole Smith. I was thinking about Marcia Clark and the O.J. Simpson trial right before I started doing You're Wrong About with Michael Hobbs. Just those morality tales specifically, because that's what they started seeming like to me, were so interesting because they were about women who like had made a mistake, but like generally not even that huge of one, but had their entire lives destroyed. And it felt like they were telling the girls of America, of which I was one at the time, sort of what they were allowed to be. And the answer was that it was hard to figure out what you were allowed to be, because you would get in as much trouble for looking, you know, trampy as men did for actually committing murder. a lot of the time, it seemed like.
Right. Right, and you get as much trouble for looking trampy as you might for looking prudy, and so there is kind of no winning. There's no way to be a woman in a way that is acceptable, and I think that's exactly what these stories are intended to tell us, is that here's all these women who have these varying experiences. You know, you take the Monica Lewinsky story as an example, like Hillary Clinton, the amount of heat that she got for not being able to please her man for whatever it was, for not being sexual enough, and then Monica Lewinsky for being this sexual deviant figure for us. And either way, both women lost in a lot of ways. Monica Lewinsky lost a lot in a different way. But in a lot of ways, both women lost. And I think that that's what these stories come to tell us, is that it doesn't matter what you do. And, you know, I wish that the takeaway from that, I wish that when I was young, the takeaway had been, it doesn't matter what you do, and thus you should do whatever you want, rather than what it feels like for a lot of young women, I think, is it doesn't matter what you do, so like, don't try, or so, like, it's just so, it's almost a crippling feeling.
Yeah, and it is sort of sketching out a world where you're also, I think, being told, like, you can't follow your own instincts because they will inevitably lead you astray, and so you have to just do whatever we tell you to do.
Yeah, I've gotten to the point in my life where, like, I just broke up with somebody because he said that Courtney Love killed Kurt Cobain, and I just can't put up with things like that anymore. I'm 26 years old. I'm done.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And, like, I'm going to think of that whenever I need to set a boundary next with somebody who is telling me something that's making me realize I suddenly cannot go on.
Because that's a value stance. Like, I obviously, okay, you can still love women and think that Courtney Love killed Kurt Cobain, I guess. Yeah, but can you?
It's hard to say. Not unequivocally, maybe. You know, because the desire to point the finger at whatever woman is closest to the scene of the crime is very interesting to me, you know, and it does feel very baked into a lot of our American fables, and this idea that, you know, women have to be very careful because we are, you know, God did make us evil. So what?
Well, and I think that in a lot of ways the take is intended to be inflammatory, which is also something that I think that masculinity is very tied into, and that, like, because I responded and I was like, you don't really think that, right? And he said, why would Kurt Cobain kill himself? He was so successful. Huh?
Okay.
What do you mean? It was the double down. It was the double down that made me break up with a man on his birthday. That was what had to happen.
Yeah. I mean, you know, he'll be okay. It's a learning experience more than anything.
So your show talks about a bunch of different topics. You don't just debunk women's stories, you debunk all kinds of moments in history, starting with the Satanic Panic. That's your first episode, right?
Yeah. Very optimistic to try and cover that all in one episode, but, you know, it's a different time.
I mean, I feel like it's been a common thread through a lot of your episodes. We come back to Satanic Panic.
Secretly, the whole show is probably really about the Satanic Panic at the end. That's the big twist.
So one of my favorite types of episodes that you do are the ones that retell the stories of women who've been scorned by media, and you often go back really deep into these people's childhoods. What do you think is the benefit of digging that deep? And when you're researching someone's story, what are the main priorities that you look for as you look into their lives?
What a great question. Thank you. I feel like I'm going basically through the route that makes the most sense to me as how the questions I naturally have that I want to bring to someone I find interesting, you know, especially someone who ended up at the center of a story that maybe they were more than passive in. You know, if someone did something extreme, because I'm drawn to those stories as well, if someone did something that makes you really wonder, how did they get to that point exactly that made sense? Then I think the story really begins with their upbringing. And I suppose it's also been very therapeutic for me as somebody who has not wanted to process the stuff directly in my own life, but is able to do it but has been able to do it through telling these other stories, to look at sort of what are the things that you experience in your early relationships, particularly with family, particularly with parents a lot of the time, or with just your first relationships, that teach you what you can put up with or what you have to put up with in your adult relationships with people. Because so many of these stories are about women who put up with too much or who didn't have a way out, or both.
Yeah, I think that's we always talk about how I feel like we reify our relationship with our parents and our relationships, and that's something that you have to unpack for often a lifetime. I see it with my friends as we are all trying to navigate the dating world. I mean, I see it with even my parents when I meet their parents, and when you meet other people's parents, you really get to see like, oh, what are these things that we have all been conditioned to believe are eternal truths, and then how do we take those as truths in our lives and allow them to control every relationship that we have moving forward. And so I think that piece of adding those details from somebody's childhood are really, really telling.
Yeah, and I know that some people are resistant to the idea of, you know, getting into a position of empathy with somebody who it feels uncomfortable to empathize with. And I think often people want to push back on that by saying that if you empathize with someone, then that amounts to saying that they had every right to do what they did. But I don't think that's true at all. I think that it's possible to understand why somebody ended up essentially only capable of the behavior that they carried out. You know, if I look at Trump, for example, who is the person surely it is hardest to empathize with at this time, like, I don't think he has a better personality. He's holding out on us, you know, this is right. It. Like, this is the person who he has to be. And that's depressing. It's more depressing for us than for him. Like, there's no way he's suffering more than most of the people whose lives he's destroying, or he's, you know, killed directly or indirectly. But it's still terrible for everyone. You know, it's no way to live, and no one would live that way if they had a choice. You know, no one wants to be a narcissist. I really still believe. And I don't think that's naive of me. Like, I don't want them in my life, but I don't think that they're happy. Because the only real happiness comes from actually being able to connect with people and to be honest with yourself. Not all the time, but to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd also argue that we as a society are comfortable with empathy. It just depends on with who. Like, I'm thinking about all of the documentaries made about, like, what's the one with Zac Efron? Extremely evil, something wicked. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or like something.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of words.
Thanks for everything. Extremely evil, super bad.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. Not fun. Not having fun. Yeah, but that's, you know, like, it's the handsome serial killers. We want to look into their past and find out, why are you the way you are? And is there a reason why you are the way you are? But for especially more marginalized people, women, people of color, people who do not fit into the traditional, like, handsome man who did a bad thing and now we all want to look into it. I mean, it's like Dexter. I mean, there's just so many stories of these white men who play God and who we find interesting and who we find as somebody who is deserving of our time and energy when it comes to doing that backtracking. But Tonya Harding isn't one of those people, right? Like, these women they're not one of those people.
Thank you.
And the things that they do are just not nearly as bad. Like, I don't understand that we do have an ability to go back and empathize with people. It just has to be the people that we think deserve empathy, even though oftentimes they are the people who have done far more violent and vicious things than the women that we are refusing to offer that empathy.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we're coming from a place of believing as a culture that being violent, destructive, being like a hot male is like cool and sexy, and it's like, it's not, actually. It turns out that having no regard for human life and just destroying everything around you is like the MO of dumb and embarrassing people, because just look at them. They've all come out into the light and they're all so embarrassing. Like, they all have crypto scams. Not all of them, but more than you would think.
Right. Cringe a little.
Yeah, it's very, and also Ted Bundy, very cringe. You want to hear about a cringe thing Ted Bundy did? Wait. Do you want to hear about a cringe thing Ted Bundy did? This is a real thing.
I do. Tell me.
He used to clip out Cassie cartoons and mail them to his girlfriend his long-suffering girlfriend who was with him through so many of his early murders unknowingly, and be like, you're like Kathy and I'm like Irving. He identified with Irving and Kathy.
Oh, that is cringe. That is cringe.
He did not deserve to be played by the guy from High School Musical. I'm sorry.
And that's the end of the show because we've said what we need to say.
Yeah, that's the truth that we've really been working up to here.
So some of the stories that you tell, like Tanya Harding's, who I didn't know very much about until I listened to your podcast, and then I was really insufferable. I watched I, Tanya with my mom, and I paused it every 5 minutes to tell her what wasn't true or what needed more development, or oh my god, it took us 4 hours to watch I, Tanya, and at the end my mom was like, don't ever talk to me again. So that's fair, but you know what, I did the Lord's work today. Okay, you walked away with a deeply nuanced view of Tanya Harding and her life, and that's what I came here for. So
and you know, and she should have gotten had to pay you for some credit hours for that, but you were so generous with her, you gave them for free.
There you go. You're welcome. But some of these stories, like Tanya Harding's, really make me go like, oh my god, I had that really wrong. Like, I only knew the headline version of this. How could I have gotten this so wrong? And how is this collective thought so dangerous to society beyond just what it makes us think about these specific women that these stories are about?
Well, I mean, I feel like the Tanya Harding story is so compelling to me because it's, you know, and then to extrapolate from that into sort of the similarities with these other narratives, it feels like they all are stories where we are kind of holding up this woman as an example of here's what you don't do, like here's what's inappropriate, and here's what I could never do, and we all have to agree we would never do this. And yet when you break it all down, they're all the most relatable behaviors, you know, of just like, you know, what Tanya Harding was sort of accused of in the public eye in 1994, and what a lot of people believed about her was that she had orchestrated this hit and had basically, you know, the way some people remembered it was that she had literally physically assaulted Nancy Kerrigan, or that she had ordered men to assault her. And really what appears to have happened is that possibly she knew in advance what was going on, and she was complicit in helping to, you know, gather information, and like they, you know, they matched her handwriting to a piece of paper where someone had written down where Nancy Kerrigan skated at the Tony Kent Arena, although they had written Toonie Can Arena, which is very cute. And so, you know, there's certainly evidence that you could use to connect her to being aware of a plot and helping to carry it out. But no one was really arguing credibly at the time that she was behind it, or that it was her idea, or certainly that she went about orchestrating it, because this is really a Jeff Deluley and his pals type of endeavor. He knew a guy who knew some guys who tried very ineptly to, and somehow ultimately succeeded in assaulting Nancy Kerrigan by hitting her with a police baton and actually missing her knee. They got her on the lower thigh, which is still a bad place to be hit, but still allows you to compete in the Olympics 6 weeks later. And so this story with Tanya Harding, to me, was interesting as someone who, first of all, was really hung up on the realities of it and wanted people to know what actually happened, and to be able to kind of draw their opinion from the realities as opposed to sort of this vague memory of what had sort of ended up being the headline at the time, or the punchline of the SNL sketches, which is probably the first place I ever saw of this. But what was interesting to me was that you had the story of someone who had done this terrible thing, but you couldn't really say what the terrible thing was, except that, well, we just didn't like her. And then we needed to come up with the reason why we didn't like her. And so we kind of, you know, we judged it. Is that so wrong?
If you had asked me, I would have been like, yeah, she personally took a tire iron to her knee. Like, that is what I thought happened. Yeah. It snowballs. Yeah.
And this sort of, what it reveals is this basic desire on the part of the American public, and, you know, in this manifesting in this particular way in the 90s, and in various ways now. Some things change, some things don't. To just like hate and mistrust women, and if you don't have a good reason, you just have to come up with one. And also to blame women for the behaviors of men, which feels you know, just very classic Puritan, you know, God made women evil kind of a belief system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's women being blamed for the behaviors of men, because not to say, I don't know, women, we have our own faults. We could do bad things, but when we look at history, a lot of the violence has been either perpetrated by men or been led by men. I mean, I used to work in the juvenile justice system, and when I was working with young girls, so 99% of them, there was a man, normally an adult man, behind whatever behavior they were exhibiting. So if they were exhibiting violence tendencies, it's like, okay, well, had they been abused? Like, more often than not, the answer was yes. Were they dealing drugs? More often than not, some adult man had them dealing drugs. Like, it's not to say that women can't make bad decisions on their own, but it is to say that there is something to be said about the ways that women can lose everything due to the bad decisions of men who will not lose everything, especially with, like, and with these young girls too, like, being able to target young women is just such a violent process because they don't have anything that they can use to protect themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I remember of Tanya's story, she didn't have much to protect herself with either. Right.
And also was really, you know, there wasn't ever really an adult in the room for her, you know, I think with the exception of her coaches. And even that, it's somebody whose relationship with you is contingent on your ability to perform at a certain level, you know? And so it also, I know that I was drawn to these stories to process the things that I was figuring out about just kind of what do we tolerate in our relationships as adults that happen based on what we go through when we're growing up. And with Tanya Harding, you know, she grew up with an abusive mother and she married an abusive husband and then, you know, had a relationship with him still ongoing after their divorce, which manifested in, you know, this plot against Nancy Kerrigan. And it was something that we saw as benefiting her at the time, but really it was like pretty obvious from the beginning who had carried it out and that it was at least connected to her. And it destroyed her ability to ever take part in this thing that had been the one thing she felt good about herself for doing ever again. And so it also makes you think about, you know, we have this idea of the master criminal who is able to carry out these plots against other people, these Machiavellian schemes, and this very apparent fantasy, especially now for Americans, of wouldn't it be great to be a con artist? Wouldn't it be great to just like sabotage others and get your way? And it's like, well, first of all, a lot of the women who we hold up as examples of doing that didn't get their way because they were really just kind of like spinning out, pardon the pun, you know, in public and kind of on their last legs and really sabotaging themselves first or, you know, in relationships that sabotage them first or both. And, you know, these people who we see as sort of role models of individuality and maybe champion as these kind of anti-folk heroes, like, are not in control of what they're doing. And it's not an enjoyable way to be. And our inability to read that is really compelling.
Right. And we're in the middle of this really poignant political moment where collective thought is extremely dangerous and is kind of controlling our political world. We are in Trump's second presidency and fascism is on the rise in a way that I at least did not perceive it in 2016 the way that I am acknowledging it now. I mean, I knew that word was being thrown around, but right now I'm like, fascism, capital F, is coming our way. Yeah. And that collective thought where it doesn't matter so much what's true, it matters what people believe. And when we're thinking about like the recent plane crash, which is so horrible, and the fact that it's been blamed on DEI, if enough people believe that, it almost becomes true.
Yeah, or at least it becomes part of the narrative and part of the fabric of the country that a lot of people are living in. And that to me sums up, you know, what feels like a belief that's helping to animate the GOP at this time of like, yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are killing people. It wasn't, you know, not having enough of a workforce at the time in order to guarantee the safety of people in American airspace. It wasn't going after federal workers. It was the fact that some people are feeling a little uncomfortable some of the time, based on the things that some people are trying to get them to think about for a second, about just broadly concepts of social justice in America. I really feel like that is something that makes no sense, but makes emotional sense to people, because it's connecting the idea of, I am uncomfortable about anything that I call woke. And this feeling of discomfort is existentially a threat to me and dangerous to me. And I could die if I keep feeling uncomfortable.
Right. And I think that, that discomfort, especially amongst white people, is something that really runs our society, is that who gets to, whose discomfort can then turn into political power. It's not just sitting. Most people have to sit in a lot of discomfort and death and fear, and that is a reality for marginalized people. But for people who have experienced a lot of privilege in their life, discomfort is sometimes the most aggressive feeling that they've felt, and so it feels bigger, and then it is able to be connected to this power structure.
Yeah, and I think implicit in that is this belief that people are all but coming out and naming, that white people are not meant to be uncomfortable, but that marginalized people are meant to suffer, and this naming a belief in a natural order dictated by white supremacy. But I feel like a lot of people, myself included, are in this feeling of free fall at this moment of oh my God, is this happening? Can this be happening? Surely this can't happen. Can this happen? And as much as I can, I'm trying to just get into the mindset of yeah, it's happening. Maybe this or that specific thing will or won't happening, but it's happening. It has happened. It's here. And then thinking about just how do we take care of ourselves and the people in our communities, and just think about this as a long-term struggle.
So this is something that I have been wanting to ask you since 2020, when I first originally got interested into the show, which is that I definitely fell into conspiracy theory trap for a minute, with, with the idea that these evil politicians are on, the QAnon stuff, evil politicians on, doing horrible child abuse things and then killing children for God knows what, all the horrible things that we assume that people in power were doing, or that there was a conspiracy theories that people in power were doing. And I fell into that because I was oh, well, people in power do bad things. So why would we put it above them than that they are abusing children regularly? That makes sense that there would be a child abuse ring happening with people in power, because people in power do bad things. And that was as simple as it came, but I was losing my mind because it was COVID. So I remember falling into that, and then my partner at the time was what are you talking about? And something that I've really wanted to ask you this whole time is just, how do you learn to be critical enough to catch false narratives, such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? That's an example of a conspiracy that really did happen and really did hurt lots of people, and that was in one way or another a conspiracy. But then we have all these other conspiracy theories that are not true and that are really harmful when you fall into that trap. How do you learn to be critical enough to understand when you need to be speaking truth to power or be critical of power, and when you are seeing demons where they don't exist?
Yeah, it's hard to know. And I think part of it is just being willing to accept that, your gut reaction doesn't have to be your only reaction. You get to reassess. And I have also, something that this is a much smaller scale, but something that I felt silly for having bought into to the extent that I did, was this sort of, first we had, Blake Lively is being so terrible while promoting her domestic violence movie. And then a couple months later we had, allegations then that in fact her co-star, who she, I believe made allegations against, Justin Baldoni, had launched a smear campaign against her. And that there had been some degree of astroturfing. And I was God damn it, I'm one of those people I don't like. And it's yes, well, welcome to the party.
Yep.
Because if you're making snap judgments about stuff that you're just hearing about as things are emerging and as things are going around kind of a rumor and speculation cycle, and as it's a little bit unclear what some of the details are, then like we get swept away. It's one of the things we do. It's one of our behaviors, and sometimes it's fun even. Especially if, you know, there are a lot of harmless things to speculate on, although we've made a lot of them weird. You know, you would think that the One Direction fandom wouldn't be able to get quite as QAnon-like as it did, but it did. So, you know, once you get into fake baby territory, it's weird. But I don't know. I think that I don't know how effective this is, but it served me decently well to this point. My approach to these things is like, well, is this the kind of conspiracy that we have seen people in the past actually manage to pull off? You know, so if you look at the idea that the moon landing was faked, that's never made sense to me, because it's just not the kind of thing that many people can keep a secret about. You know, like my belief has always been that large conspiracies are hard to cover up if everyone agrees that what they're doing is bad and must be a secret. And so if you look at something like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, oh my God, it's a hard phrase to say.
It is.
And so if you look at something like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, I mean, that worked as a conspiracy because it was based on white doctors and white scientists conspiring pretty openly to intentionally, you know, withhold treatment from Black men suffering with syphilis. That might actually, we made that episode years ago. I'm probably incorrect about some aspect of that, and someone can correct me. But that was the gist of it, that it was that was a large scale conspiracy to commit medical malpractice against people of color by white doctors. And that obviously worked because that was what Americans were agreeing to do at the time, you know, was basically to harm and kill people of color with impunity, and that was just the kind of thing that you could get away with, because there were enough people who were in power, who were willing to just kind of basically believe that was probably okay. And if you have something, you know, therefore functioning with those in power conspiring against people who don't have powerful representatives, and in a culture that is already based on, you know, performing this kind of harm in a less organized fashion every day, then that makes sense, and it's not that difficult to do. And then, you know, something like the Satanic Panic, which manifests as a lot of conspiracy theories about, well, you know, the Satanists, there are these Satanists in America. They're in out of them. They look respectable in the daytime. They work at hardware stores. They work as teachers in schools. They work as daycare providers. They work as doctors and nurses and lawyers. And they look just like you and me. And then they go home and they put on their robes and they gather in barns and they sacrifice babies and they slaughter animals and they do all these arcane rituals. And no one ever has found a single piece of physical evidence of it. We've never found a robe. We've never found a piece of a robe, unless it turns out to be a graduation robe. We've never found any of these dead baby bodies. We've never found evidence of where they're getting all the babies from that they're sacrificing. There certainly aren't that many babies going missing all the time. It's a side issue. You know, we can't identify the places where this is occurring or evidence of physically of where this is occurring, or, you know, and no one has ever slipped up until now. But it is happening, right? And that's just obviously now pretty incredible. It was easier to believe when things were slowly trickling out, and when you started off believing something a lot more believable, and then as it spiraled and as the years passed, the things you had to believe for it all to make sense became more and more extreme.
Right.
But if you look then at, for example, you know, in 2001, the big spotlight report from the Boston Globe was really like, I remember that moment, and it was a watershed time in terms of people realizing that the Catholic Church had been abusive toward children, and sexually and had, you know, fostered and allowed sexual abuse of children by clergy members for a very long time. And that wasn't something that was hard to believe because it was based on this idea of this extremely hierarchical, I mean, the way that Satanists are imagined by a lot of people claiming that they were organized in the 80s, that actually broke down to sounding a lot like a Catholic church or like a Christian, some kind of Christian denomination, but just the opposite, apparently. But mimicking this idea of, well, wouldn't it be scary if you had this rigid hierarchy where everyone had to follow the demands of whoever was above them and whoever was at the top, and where children were forced to follow arcane rituals that they didn't understand and be punished if they screwed them up somehow, and to, you know, do things that they didn't want to do out of the fear that something terrible would happen to them or their families. And it's like, yeah, that would be bad. That was happening. We just didn't name it for what it was. And we had to make up this whole other thing and invent people to accuse. And I think, you know, to look at the example I mentioned earlier of the moon landing being faked, like, I don't think that happened, but like the federal government and, you know, the FBI and the CIA were doing absolutely terrible things during the 60s in terms of, you know, trying to destabilize Central American governments and trying to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide. And so I think that often the conspiracy theories that we talk about, we're talking about something that we should be afraid of and that is happening in some way, but we are phrasing it in a way that allows us to accuse people in a way that doesn't feel too existentially terrifying. Because in a way, it's less scary to believe that Satanists are abusing children than to believe that just Christian churches are abusing children.
Totally. And I feel like that makes a lot of sense to me because I'm thinking about how, like, yeah, these are very real fears and understandable fears and probably a good thing to be afraid of, but it's the stories that we tell around it. Like, child sexual abuse is happening. More likely than not, it happens in the home with people that children know. Very unlikely is that children are being kidnapped and then, like, you know, bought into whatever kind of the crazy conspiracy theory that you hear. But it's not to say that child and sexual abuse is not happening. It's to say that it's not happening in the way that we are being told. And I think that piece of, like, looking at the structural implications, like with the syphilis experiment, like, there are structural and hierarchical implications of why this happened rather than things happening randomly. And it's a lot easier for people to believe that things are happening with a randomness and with a sinisterness rather than with within the structures that they have built, that they trust, like their families, like the church, and that it's happening, like, right under your nose is much scarier.
Yeah. Or, you know, and to get into some of the conspiracy theories, like a big one of the past 5 years is this thing of, like, I'm a white woman and someone was in the same aisle as me twice at Target and they almost human trafficked me. And also, if you see a zip tie on the handle of your car door, do you remember this one? If
oh, yeah.
Zip tie,
my mom would send me these.
Yeah. And it's just like, okay. Like, if I'm a sexual predator, which for the record I'm not, but if I was, like, would I zip tie the car door of a random white woman so that I could, like, kidnap her and brand her and sell her for sexual slavery for, like, God knows what kind of turnaround? Like, what kind of numbers am I doing here? Why is this profitable to me? How many white women do I need to get per week? You know, what's my quota here? Who's under me? Is it like an MLM? Do I have a downline? Etc. Right?
So, like, there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, if we're doing large-scale human trafficking, we immediately generate some uncomfortable questions about, like, what is the business model? How does this work? You know, whereas at the time that these conspiracies were going around, we had yet to break the big story about Jeffrey Epstein, which is like, well, you actually just need one scary rich guy and, like, a few people under him doing his bidding in order to target vulnerable young women, of which, you know, they are legion, and just be emotionally coercive and legally threatening and terrifying and physically threatening. And you don't need and you can involve world leaders in your conspiracy just by, like, offering them sexual favors and having them therefore have, you know, your dirt on their hands and make it mutual. You know, it's Don't make it too complicated for yourself. You can be very evil with minimal effort. You don't have to try this hard.
No zip ties necessary, I promise. There's easier ways to commit heinous crimes. Yeah, if you have to jump through that many hoops, then maybe it's not that true.
Yes. And also more to the point, like if a man in America wants to do horrible things to a woman, like a lot of the times he'll just date her and marry her. And that's when the worst things happen. You know, there's a reason it was these like bored married white women coming up with imaginary, you know, implicitly men of color to be sexual predators for them. And it's like, look at your husbands. Look at Brandon and Landon, you know, like they're the ones you need to be worried about.
Right, but it's so much scarier to be afraid of Brad than it is to be scared of the guy at the boogeyman in the corner, you know? Like it's way easier to believe that somebody is out to get you when you know. And I think that's a part of it is that women do feel on edge, they feel fearful, they feel like there is somebody out to get them, and that is rooted in reality. But instead of acknowledging who they actually should be afraid of, it's easier to find these other roots for who I should be afraid of that are much less true, but like and don't actually keep anybody safe. I think that's another piece of it is that like when we hear these stories, all it does is make me really on edge when I'm in a parking garage. Like it's not actually keeping me safer. I'm just alarmed all the time versus, and I don't want to talk to people anymore. I'm scared when somebody talks to me on the streets.
You're more likely to mace someone or shoot someone, which is, you know, not great. Yeah.
Right. And not great.
Yeah. And the party that likes to accuse people of being triggered is the party of going around feeling triggered all the time because it would be unpatriotic to not, evidently.
Totally. And I think of like just the true crime stories that are all about, you know, women being raped and murdered and all the stories that really I have had my many complicated feelings about it that I think I've found a happy medium. For a while I was like, true crime is evil. Everyone who listens to it, who reads it is evil. Like I had a very strong, intense stance on it. And I think I've come to something more nuanced, which is that there's an understandable reason why it's entertaining. And also I don't think it's great for society. But when you're...
It's kind of like Skittles. It's like, are they good for us? Like, not really. Right. But like, do we need them sometimes? Yeah, we do. We need Skittles.
Right. I'm done. I'm grown out of the phase of actively judging people who watch true crime and into a phase of how does this impact us as a society? And I think that something with, you know, keeping women so terrified of the people around us rather than of the actual threats to us also keeps us from building community, right? Like, it's like, how do you talk to your neighbor when you're supposed to be afraid that your neighbor's going to hurt you? How do you ask directions anymore if that person's going to hurt you because the people we should be afraid of are in the streets, not in our homes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where I start to feel a little bit conspiratorial myself because I don't think that the political right in this country has like meetings where they decide this is what they're going to say, but I think they are drawn to each other because of a shared pathology. And part of that is this need to, like a cult leader, because we're all living inside the walls of a massive cult now, to separate people from their communities, because if everyone's afraid of their neighbors, then they're more likely to believe in sane conspiracy theories that they encounter on Facebook, you know?
Totally. So Sarah, the 4 tenets of reproductive justice are the right to have children, the right to not have children. This is my spiel.
I love it.
The right to raise our children in safe and sustainable environments, free of the threat of violence from individuals or the state, and the right to bodily autonomy. And so it kind of covers a lot of topics, which is why this whole podcast is about how everything is reproductive justice. Why do you think that centering women in their own stories is part of a reproductive justice process?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that if we think about the complexity of women's stories, and if we really see them as individuals, then we see them much more clearly as people whose lives are separate and distinct and aren't all part of the same narrative template, you know, and that everyone's life requires a different kind of relationship to reproduction. I got there.
Yeah. I think that being able to share, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought.
I love it.
But yeah, being able to center women in their own stories allows us to humanize them and really see them as full people who have complicated lives. And I think that when we also add in the piece about being free from violence from individuals in the States, so many of these stories do include violence from individuals, which ends up leading to these long-term relationships of violence that you may think are normal, that you may think are something that you deserve, whatever that looks like. And so it does really shape, like being part of a violent childhood, a violent history does shape the rest of your life. And it does shape these stories that you're telling, right? About people like Tonya Harding, about people like Amy Winehouse. Like, these are stories of women who have experienced really challenging things that have continued in their life. And so being able to see people, and we always talk about Sister Song, that everybody has a reproductive justice story. And that doesn't have to have anything with reproduction. It can just be about how the things in your life have shaped who you are and have created this lens that you see the world in that may or may not allow you to have bodily autonomy and feel that you have this ability to control your own body and have the right to control your own body. Yeah, and so I think that reproductive justice story is kind of what you do. You tell these reproductive justice stories, whether or not they have anything to do with reproduction.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that, because I agree. I think that we all have a relationship to reproductive justice, whether we're aware of it or not, because it's so deep in the fabric of just existing as a human being. And I do think that there is a sort of human impulse and a desire, for good or for bad, because like there are great sort of story archetypes, there are great story templates, like we wouldn't have popular entertainment without them, because we can't get so specific all the time. Sometimes you just need to be inside of an action movie where you kind of know the different archetypes you're working with. Sometimes you just need to be inside of a musical and you kind of know what structure is happening. But I think in terms of like relating to real people and real stories, like our desire for reality and our desire for nuance is one of the things that will save us and help us keep seeing each other and not the archetypes that we're being told sometimes very manipulatively to see each other as, because if we all see each other as villains and heroes, and if we see whoever makes us uncomfortable or who disagrees with us as a threat to our safety, then we stop seeing each other as people, and we stop feeling fully in community with each other. Right. And I think that, that the desire for I get pleasure out of knowing people's stories. I love knowing that, like, Nicole Brown Simpson, when she was young, once fell disastrously off. I love knowing that Nicole Brown Simpson, when she was young, once fell disastrously off of a horse I know that I'm going to do that one more time and I'm going to get it.
Go ahead.
I love knowing that Nicole Brown Simpson, when she was young, once fell disastrously, I think, off of a bike that she wasn't supposed to be riding at the time, and sort of laughed it off, because that's sort of like a character detail about a person that helps you see them and feel like, I know this person a little bit, or I think I do. Mm-hmm. It's presumptuous to feel like we can know someone completely from what's left behind after they're gone, but there are these moments of connection that you feel learning any story of oh, this is I know this person, and I know them in a way that feels deeper and more nourishing than the way I feel like I know an archetype. Because to know someone as an archetype is to feel them as sort of a part of yourself and something that you can sort of project yourself into to feel a part of the story. But to relate to someone as a real person is to have some kind of an actual relationship in some form, if only for an instant, with somebody who you are encountering through narrative. And I think that makes us see so much more clearly that we are surrounded by real people in this world, and that our survival is dependent on everyone else's survival.
Yeah, it's almost like finding the things from an old, great grandparent that you never met or something. It's somebody that you're connected to, that you have some sort of relationship with, but you also don't. And I think, with people who are in the public eye and we don't have a relationship with them, but you do know that you're connected in some way and that there's something there. You have an opinion on them. Everybody around you seems to have an opinion on them. And so being able to get that joy of building that connection. And I think that joy and that pleasure too runs a lot of, or that comfort even runs a lot of what we do. Even going back to the conspiracy theory piece, there's something really pleasurable about thinking that you know something that everybody else doesn't know. Like there's a joy that comes out of that. Like I remember when I was working with teenagers, they would come to me and they were like, "Oh, Miss Simran, did you know the moon landing was staged?" And I was like, "Nope, I hadn't heard." But like yeah, just talking about like they got really in conspiracy theories, and the joy of it was being able to share with people something that they didn't know. Like that, and especially as a young person, you know, you feel like you are disconnected from knowing things that people don't know. Like it gives you access to that. And so, and I remember telling them like, okay, I don't care if you're into conspiracy theories, but there's a difference between the moon landing was staged and the Holocaust didn't happen. Like those are not on the same level. So please pick your conspiracy theories wisely. Some of them are bad for people. And so
it's like gambling, like know your limits, set a budget when you go out to look at conspiracy theories.
Exactly. I'm like, sure. Like if you really want to get into the moon landing being staged, like I don't think that bothers me. I don't know if it's supposed to bother me, but I don't think I care.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like it, but I'm comfortable with you not caring, you know, because it's like there's a limit to how deep it gets. And I've always liked the, you know, Room 237, the movie about people's sort of reads on Kubrick's The Shining. And one of them is like, it's a confession about how he staged the moon landing. And you're like,
The Shining?
Sure, why not? Have some fun. You know?
No way.
Yeah. Yes, it's a fun movie.
Oh, that is entertaining. Okay. So, Sarah, most of your stories focus on past events and stories. What is the takeaway that you want people to have for the present day?
I mean, I think the takeaway that I hope people get from my show, I'm happy with whatever they get that's useful to them. But what I'm thinking about currently and trying to focus on in my work that has definitely been a through line for me is just this idea that the deeper you get into most stories, the closer you get to understanding humanity more. You see things that are familiar to you and that are endearing to you and that hopefully make you understand yourself more through the lens of other people, and that make you understand more deeply the things that we share and also the things that we don't share, because there are a lot of situations that we may imagine we have some ability to guess what it's like. And then the deeper we get into the details and the more we hear about the story, the more we realize that whatever assumptions we started off with are like pretty off base.
Right.
And just that, you know, knowledge is our friend, and knowledge may make us uncomfortable, but that discomfort is going to take us to a good place. And it's the discomfort that drives us into ignorance that's going to hurt us in the end. Knowledge is good. Knowledge is good. Knowledge is good. That's a good way to end. I like that. That is my wild theory at this moment. Knowledge is good.
Yeah, have y'all thought about knowing things? Knowing things can be cool.
Let me tell you something. It's dope.
It's dope. You guys got to try this. Come and get a hit of this. Let me tell
you, fellow kids. Yeah.
Stay in school, kids. That's Sarah Marshall's final stance.
Stay in school because it's the best.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate getting to learn from you. And yeah, thanks. This was awesome.
Thank you so much. This has been, I don't know. I have loved talking to you so much. I feel like my brain has been carbonated, and I'm going to go forth carbonated into the rest of the day. And just thank you for the Sex in the City.
Oh yeah. Hey, my brain is carbonated too, whatever the fuck that means. So
yeah. It's, you know, it's more delicious than it was when we started off.
Yeah, it's a little fizzy. I like it.